Just to continue to help us understand more about the current state of wellbeing in Australia, I'd like to invite up Professor Jacki Schirmer to be able to share a little bit more around what is happening in Australia right now. Thanks so much, Jacki.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, the current state of wellbeing in Australia. Not a hard thing to characterise at all, but we're going to try and do it in about 15 minutes. Do we feel confident? Excellent, that's great. So we're going to try and talk about how many and which Australian residents have high wellbeing, that question of who's got the opportunities for a great quality of life and who doesn't. We're going to talk about whether our communities are supporting good wellbeing for all. In an ideal world, we'd be evaluating is our wellbeing at the expense of others. I probably can't go too far to that today, but I think that's something we'll discuss through the coming days. And we also need to think about, is our wellbeing sustainable over the long term? And again, not the question we can answer in the next 15 minutes, but one I encourage you all to reflect on because it's a critical question for our times. When we're asked to track the wellbeing of Australians, I have a difficulty because I am a data nerd and I immediately go, look at all the places I can get some really cool data. I could talk for hours on this. And I'm just put up on the screen here just some of the many amazing sources of data we have currently on the wellbeing of Australians. Globally, we have the OECD producing its Better Life Index. We have the World Happiness Report. We have the Human Development Index. Nationally, we have Measuring What Matters and many, many other data collections from the ABS. We have the Australian Unity Wellbeing Index. We have the surveys that are run here at UC. We have MyKawai, the National Survey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Wellbeing, SGS Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index, the Australian Child and Youth Wellbeing Atlas, and many more. And more jurisdictions are doing their own wellbeing measurement. I can't talk to all of those today as much as I'd love to spend 8 hours boring you with that. So what I'm going to do is hit some highlights and unfortunately, some challenges that we're seeing because some of these sources are showing some very similar trajectories for Australia's wellbeing at the moment. So let's start by asking how we stack up globally. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, things look pretty rosy. The OECD has Australia at the 7th best out of 41 countries in terms of wellbeing. The World Happiness Report ranks us 11th out of more than 140 countries. Human Development Index ranks us at 7th out of more than 70 countries. Sounds fantastic. And if we have a look on the screen there, this is from the OECD Better Life Index. You're not meant to be able to read it. Australia's the one that I've just highlighted there. That's a whole list of countries. The height is the height of their wellbeing index score. So fantastic, we're all done. We do not need to be here for the next couple of days. We're all good, right? When we get into it, of course, we get some different stories. Even within those international indexes, which we can all criticise in different ways, and as someone who loves wellbeing measurement, anyone find me at lunch, I'll talk to you about why I would prefer not to use the Canberra ladder measure or things like that. But even within these, when we actually break down the Better Life Index, it has many different indicators and wraps them up into an index. Australia does really well on some things, but we're only 20th on social connection. And that's the one that I'm highlighting on the screen at the moment. And if I go to the next screen, we're 33rd on work-life balance. I'd like to point out I found that out at 5 p.m. on Sunday when I was preparing this presentation. It felt quite appropriate. So we are doing well on material things. We're doing well on some aspects of civic engagement. We're doing well on knowledge and skills. But things have been changing. So the World Happiness Report is one of the few studies that has consistently measured things over time, so we get a sense of change. This is showing the change in what's called the life evaluation measure used in the World Happiness Report. It's the change between 2019, before COVID, and 2024. Australia's highlighted in pink. Our scores dropped by 0.2. Doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a persistent drop in wellbeing, and we're one of only 5 countries out of the top 20 that have had a decline this size or larger. So in other words, we're in the top level, but our wellbeing has been declining, and not just in the World Happiness Report, there's a couple other studies suggesting similar things. So our happy position up the top is under threat. And probably more importantly, when we look at how we're doing, the World Happiness Report looks at wellbeing inequality. How many people are at the bottom end? How many people are at the top end? Are we seeing most people having good wellbeing and very few at very high and very low? Or are we really split? Out of the top 14 countries, we're actually the third most unequal in our wellbeing. So in terms of wellbeing inequality, this is the inequality index. You can see it just ticks up a bit towards the end there. That's the last few years we're seeing wellbeing inequality increasing in Australia. Our score of wellbeing inequality of 36 is shown on the right there. That means that we're seeing a spread. There's some people doing really well in Australia, but there's also some people not doing well. What does wellbeing inequality look like? I'm now showing data from Measuring What Matters. See that flat line there? That's what wellbeing inequality looks like when we look at an average. And that's the problem. We must move beyond the averages because it looks like there's nothing to see here. Well, the bottom line does show some things heading downwards. But when you look into the Measuring What Matters reports that were released only a few weeks ago, we see very big differences in the wellbeing of younger and older people that are highlighted in the Measuring What Matters data. Much lower wellbeing for people who have a diagnosed mental health condition, for people who live with disability, people with long-term health conditions, and we can keep going on. We can highlight the groups who have fewer opportunities for wellbeing, and we know there's many, so we must move beyond the flat lines. And we also need to look at what are our wellbeing strengths and challenges, because we keep on being excited that we are up the top. But when we look into Measuring What Matters, I'll briefly summarise some of the things. We often talk about Australia being fantastic on health. We have great life expectancy, one of the highest in the world. When you dig into that data more, we're living longer, but our chronic conditions are going up and our access to health services is getting poorer. We have more people saying they can't access the healthcare they need. We still have one of the most enviable healthcare systems in the world, but we're seeing signs of stress and strain in recent years, and they're coming through loud and clear in multiple of the studies that I referred to earlier. When we look at security, sense of safety has declined, and our sense of safety in the world has actually declined. When we move on and look at sustainability, we can point to the fact that yes, we're reducing emissions. Yes, protected areas, the area that's protected for nature conservation has gone up, but our biological diversity continues to decline rapidly. When we look at social cohesion, our sense of belonging has actually declined over the last 2 decades in Australia. The Scanlon Social Cohesion Index showed, like many indexes, that during COVID we actually saw an increase in social cohesion, but since COVID it's returned back to a little bit below those pre-COVID levels. We have some concerns about social connection in Australia. And where we tend to be strong is in our economy, where we have seen household income and wealth increase despite the cost of living crisis, but our income and wealth inequality has also increased. Our gender pay gap has gotten smaller, but overall real wage growth hasn't been as high as we want it to be. So lots of different things going on in Australia. Now, all of that makes me want to unpack things more, and that's where we're very lucky in Australia to have a number of different studies that are looking and digging down in depth into what's happening with wellbeing. So before we talk about those, we do need to talk about closing the gap. We will hear more about it later in the conference, but the latest Closing the Gap measures also show that mixed picture. We're trying to close the gap for First Nations peoples. When we look at how we're going on the Closing the Gap dashboard, we only have 4 out of 17 indicators that are improving at the rate we want them to, that we have agreed is the rate that needs to happen to close the gap. We have 7 more that are improving, but not at the rate we want them to. We have 4 that are worsening, and we have some that are either not changing or where we have no assessment available. So let's talk about some of those reports and products that are available, and today we actually have one that's being launched today The 2025 Australian Unity Wellbeing Index results are being launched today, and you'll be able to access them online. For those who aren't familiar with it, the AUWI is a 25-year collaboration between Australian Unity and Deakin University. And it's increased its sample size, so it is now sampling over 10,000 Australian adults each year, which is enabling, for the first time this year, some publication of data that is looking by electorate and across Australia to look at some of the differences within Australia. I won't get into the technical details, but I would encourage you to have a look at the report and talk to some of the Deakin representatives and AUWI representatives here about the methods that are used. But let's talk about how Australians are feeling in 2025. This is some of our most recent data because data was collected halfway through this year. And it's actually showing that, again, we have our line, our average is staying relatively stable for personal wellbeing. That's how we're feeling about our lives, the personal wellbeing index. But it's also showing that younger adults are continuing to struggle. We have persistent inequities there. People on lower incomes, renters, those who are unemployed, continue to record some of the lowest levels of wellbeing. There's also a measure of national wellbeing. How are we feeling about the communities and the nation that we live in? That's actually improved this year. We've seen an increase. And that's the first one we've seen for a while. So that's actually exciting news, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk first about personal wellbeing and how it looks when we start looking across the country. When we look at who's scoring the highest on personal wellbeing, if we look by electorate, the electorates that have the highest personal wellbeing are mostly in capital cities, not in the rural areas. They mostly have older populations and more socioeconomically secure populations, so higher household income, lower unemployment rates, fewer renters. I don't think any of this comes as a surprise, but it just highlights again that need for action to address persistent differences that we see. And when we look at urban and regional divides, we again see some pretty important differences. This is now breaking personal wellbeing into different components. So AUWI uses what's called the Personal Wellbeing Index. It asks people how satisfied they are with their standard of living, their health, what they're achieving in life, their relationships, their safety, their community connectedness, and their future security. And when we have a look at it, we see higher satisfaction with health and lower satisfaction with relationships in cities. And then we see the reverse in rural areas, poorer health, but we're happier with our social connections and our relationships. So some really important divides that we've known for a while, but really stands out starkly in these new findings. When it comes to national wellbeing, however, it's not quite as positive for rural areas. Their personal wellbeing is still tracking okay, but they're not feeling as confident about how their local area and the nation are going as capital cities. On that map, there are little bits of green there that are good. They're mostly in the capital cities. If you live in regional areas, you're feeling less confident about the future in Australia. And again, we can have a look at that and break it down. There's actually a fantastic data dashboard that's been released, so I'll let you log on to that in a minute using this. So if you want to have a look and play with the data dashboard that's being released today, please scan the code, have a look and a play, obviously in break times. Chat to the Australian Unity and the Deakin folks who are here, and they'll be happy to take you through it, and we'll have some materials out the front. That's not all the results we want to talk about today, though. So we also want to dig into that idea of the regional-urban divide a little more. And this is showing data from our regional wellbeing survey. This is run here at UC. We sample 15,000 people every year, most in regional areas outside cities. One of the concerning things we are seeing is a decline in confidence in the future of communities that is particularly happening in our outer regional and our remote communities. So for those not familiar with how we talk about rural Australia, it's not just cities and rural, it's how rural you are. So if you're living just outside the cities, you can still get to services in big towns pretty easily. That's inner regional. If you're a bit further out, takes a fair bit to drive places, that's outer regional. If you're properly in remote areas where you might need to fly to see a doctor, that's remote and very remote. And we've seen a big decline in confidence of people living in outer regional and remote communities in whether their community has a bright future. So we are seeing a growing divide between city and inner regional and outer regional and remote over time in the Regional Wellbeing Survey. And when we look at some of the things that explain that, we can actually start to see pretty easily that we're seeing a gap in provision of some of the things we need for a good life. I've just got one example here looking at general health services. General health services just means things like GPs. We ask on the survey, how good or poor is your access to general health services? And we've been asking that since 2013. The pink line is people living in regional Australia outside of major cities. The blue line is people living in major cities. Both have actually declined significantly over time. So not only is there a 20-point percentage gap between cities and rural with being able to access basic health services, less than half of regional Australians have easy access to basic health services. And that's declined over time by about, I'm trying to add up here, 25%. That's huge in the space of a decade to see that loss. So this is when we talked earlier about some strain on health services. We're seeing, this is where we start to see where it's happening. Now, we're doing more work in this space with the Gardner Foundation on a project that's looking at going beyond just rural Australia to looking at the diversity of needs of different rural communities, and you'll hear more about that in later sessions, because just talking about regional Australia is not good enough. If we want to put wellbeing into action, we have to get specific. We have to talk to local communities and measure the things that matter for different local communities. Now, a lot of those things are similar across communities, but some differ. In the 3 communities we're working with in this particular project, Gannawarra, Stratford and Greater Shepparton, people have been telling us that in their communities, they're feeling they're unable to influence the decisions that are affecting their future, and that that's something we need to measure in wellbeing frameworks. They're feeling that decisions are being made in the cities that are affecting them and that they're not able to influence all the time. They're also telling us they still love living in rural areas because they get into nature and it's right in their backyard, because people look out for each other and actually step up and feel a sense of obligation to each other that they feel is different to what happens in the cities. And that highlights that when we think about wellbeing in action, we must talk specifically. So it's easy for me to put up a graph like this. This one is showing what's your likelihood of having good wellbeing. And you can see that if you're retired, older, you generally have a higher chance of being in pretty good wellbeing. If you're an unpaid carer down at the bottom left-hand side, you've got a much lower likelihood of having good wellbeing. We do need to know this stuff to help us drive action, but we actually need to know more than that. It's not enough just to label groups. So let's talk about what it means to move from this sort of data to talking about action, because that's what we want to do over the next few days. I actually won't give the Living Well in the ACT region example because Bill did it brilliantly for me. So I was going to talk about our Living Well in the ACT region survey, and that we've recently identified in our last survey that 30 to 49-year-olds are a key group that's experiencing declining wellbeing in the ACT. It's a specific finding, and what we've been doing is working with the ACT government, with groups like Volunteering ACT, to make sure we're understanding what the pressures on that group are. Because if we want to go into action, hands up if you're willing. Who's 30 to 49-year-old and feeling a bit of time pressure? Feeling time pressure? Sorry, I'm 50, but I count myself in the group. Okay, so what we're seeing, 30 to 49-year-olds feeling more lonely, but massive demands on them for volunteering. They're always with people, but not feeling like they're with people. Their cost of living's hit hard. Women in particular have lower physical activity in this age group. Don't know if that's connecting to anyone out there. So if we want to act on that, what does that look like? It's not just government. It's about talking to schools and saying, okay, when you do volunteering, how can we help people feel connected to each other and not just standing on that goal line, feeling terrified when they make the call that some other parent's going to yell at them? These are some of the cultural shifts we need to help this group feel connected, to help them feel supported. And I'm going to finish by talking about unpaid carers as an example. So Bill already mentioned unpaid carers are a group that have some of the lowest wellbeing of any Australian. So as the most recent results released last week, 38.9% of Australia's unpaid carers have what we would consider healthy levels of wellbeing. It's incredibly low. And all of us, almost all of us, at some stage in our life will be an unpaid carer. It tends to be something you do for a period of your life and then move out of. While you're doing it, often your wellbeing is quite low. And that's not okay. We want to change that. But to change that, we have to look at what needs to change for a carer to have high wellbeing. And what we know is that it's not just about take a break and take care of yourself. Carers get really angry when we say that, because that is something that means they give up their obligation to take care of the person they're taking care of. They worry that that person will not be okay if they take time for themselves. If we want to support wellbeing, we need to move away from saying, just go and take a walk, just go and take some time, to putting in place meaningful systems where they have access to respite care, where they can trust the person that they are caring for is being taken care of. If you are a carer who has access to satisfactory respite care services, and there's not many of them, you have a 60% likelihood of having good wellbeing. If you don't have the respite care services you need, which is most carers, 27% chance of having good wellbeing. That's the sort of difference we're talking about by providing those supports. We need to support employers to support carers. If you're a carer and you're working and your employer is understanding and supportive, 48% have good wellbeing in that group. If your employer is not understanding, high wellbeing or healthy wellbeing drops to 26%. So clear areas for action are coming out of the data that we're getting there. And we need to make sure they're targeted to the needs of the person. What works for someone who's not a carer will not always work for someone who is a carer. So we must be targeted. So in conclusion, if we come back to that idea of what's the state of wellbeing in Australia, yes, we still have high wellbeing for many Australians, but not all, and not for all our aspects of wellbeing. We're really strong in material wealth and long life. We are not as strong in social connection, belonging, services, and health. We have rising inequality in wellbeing in this country, and that includes both persistent differences in wellbeing opportunities that have persisted for generations for some people, and growing differences for others. We have new groups emerging who are having less opportunities for wellbeing. And that's people like the rural communities, the renters, the 30 to 49-year-olds. I haven't even mentioned people affected by cumulative disasters. Within every group, though, there is diversity that we can learn from to identify action. Within our carers, we learn from the carers who have high wellbeing because that tells us what we need to put in place for others. Those are the actions we need to look for, and we need to learn from those experiences and tailor our actions to the unique wellbeing needs of different groups. Thank you.